Well, hello there. It's another 425 show. I am Shannon Keene, and we are starting in on a new area that we've been exploring on the 425 show. Get to level 400 on the 425 show. So there's been a lot of planning cycles that we've gone through internally, and we've got a series of planned sessions coming up over the next couple of months. So right now, it will be one per month, and we've decided to start with conditional access. It gets a lot of topics shared on social media, and we thought we would go to the source directly. So, without further ado, let me introduce our guest here. So, let me bring Caleb in from the backstage. So, here is Caleb Baker, folks. Hi, Caleb. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me, Shannon. It's
Of
exciting to
course.
kind of be like trying this new format out.
Yeah, and we always experiment. We never quite know how this is going to land. We hope it's going to land well, but we never quite know. So, it's one of those things where we know that the folks that follow us on social media, they love more technical content, and we thought you would be a great guinea pig. So, hopefully, it's a great experience for everybody. But you are the first, so I'm sure we'll learn quite a bit as we go through this together.
All right. Definitely love the mindset and the stepping into the experiment in the
Yeah.
laboratory.
Try to reach as many people as possible.
Yeah.
So so I think you've got a session planned today to talk through conditional access,
Yeah.
and you are on the feature team, right?
I am
You're
on
one
the
of the
feature
feature
team.
PMs.
Yes. I'm
Yeah,
a
okay.
product manager on the core of conditional access policy. Been working on it for quite a while now. So this is within Azure Active Directory, within the identity security protection organization, which also owns features like multi-factor authentication offering
Okay.
and identity protection.
Very cool. Very cool. So it sounds like you're a seasoned veteran. So you are the right candidate to go deep, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, and kind of to that, so I have a couple of disclaimers. So this is a 400 level, or at least intended to be a 400 level talk. It's going to be lovely to
It's for
hear the
it's for the folks
feedback.
who already know, right? It's for the folks who
Already
already know.
know, yes. If you're just like, oh, I've heard about this conditional access thing, I'd like to learn what it is. This is not the talk for you. A lot of the things that I'll be talking about, I would hope that most people don't really need to understand. This is if you want to dig deeper, really have some of the tools for troubleshooting, really, be able to help teach others too. I think that would be some great goals out of this. But again,
Sure.
like if you're just interested in like learning about conditional access, like there's a lot of other super content out there. The other caveat I kind of have on here too is just like this is really focused on like what we're doing now, like how conditional access
Okay.
policy behaves today. This is not
Sure.
a roadmap or what's coming or how we're going to do some things that are going to maybe even going to like enhance some of the capabilities that I'm talking about. Like I'll mention some of the areas a little bit, but I'm not really going to go into those. This
Sure.
is a
Makes
very
sense.
cool. Okay, so just hopefully set everyone's expectations so that people don't go through the talk and then like are like, what am I listening to?
Yeah.
And then this within that kind of like pruned it down because even now I need to like have a lot to go through, but it's sort of like an important topic in terms of like thinking about policies and authoring policies about like how are they targeted towards apps and services to make
Mhm.
sure that you know the policy being created matches expectations. So kind of begin touching on some of the concepts around like cloud app policy assignment, which is a much richer topic than it may sound. Excluding apps and services, some that are excluded by default. And then just like conversation around like the Microsoft service list and then Microsoft Graph API and how that works with conditional access is another common area for conversation and questions. So I wanted to get into that a little bit.
Sure. Makes sense. Makes sense.
Cool. So with that, just as like the one of the big framing original motivations around conditional access policy, I think is important to spend a moment on as we go and talk about some of these other behaviors, because this is like kind of the fundamental motivation for a lot of the behaviors that you're going to see, which is conditional access policy originally was kind of designed and thought about and planned around protecting resources. So some of the real initial scenarios where it was protecting access to SharePoint files, protecting access to your mail and exchange. Now, those are targeted towards those service endpoints, so like the application identifier on those services. But really the idea was that you would be protecting that data. So if
Sure.
you came in through the SharePoint, in the browser and had to apply a policy, it would be protected. Or if you came through Word, it would also be protected. And when you're doing that, of course, like there's all these like rich set of policies you can apply, which you probably all know about, for like strong authentication, device health, specific devices, location. But ultimately, whenever you're creating those policy, there's kind of like that target of the resource that you're really going to try and protect it against.
Sure.
Cool. Now, all that's done in here. There are more ways to target policies. There's like actions and authentication context, which I had originally planned to cover in this talk as well too. But I think that might
Awesome.
have done later
Well,
because
and we can always have you back,
these.
right? That's the
Yeah,
that's the beauty of
exactly.
this, right? Like I know where you work, you know where I work, and it's just a matter of us having a scheduled conversation and then have you back on the show.
Right. Exactly. So I not ignoring those due to not wanting to cover them, but I think just we have enough here. So
Sure.
when you go in, you do the app selection. This is kind of like we're going to be talking about a lot, is targeting specific applications or this all cloud options. And what do these really mean? What's the impact of these choices? Now, first question is like, okay, we're talking about cloud apps. Like, what
Right.
are cloud apps?
Right.
And this name also goes pretty far back in terms of the development of conditional access policies, where within Azure AD, there's this pattern of calling kind of everything an app. It's, the service that lives up in the cloud. It's the service, or it's the, you know, app that you've downloaded from the app store that's on your
Sure.
iPhone. So cloud app was kind of meant to be in as like the way to distinguish kind of those categories. So cloud app is meant to capture like this, it is a website, it's a web service, it's like running remotely.
Okay.
So when you go into like the cloud app picker, that's what you'll see. Now, cloud apps are not like mobile and desktop applications.
Okay.
Occasionally I get questions around like, why don't I see like, Word on the app picker or
Sure.
OneDrive Sync on the app picker? And, at a high level, that's the reason. Like those would be desktop applications running
Got
on
it.
your device, right? And the reason that we have like this targeting around like cloud apps versus the desktop and mobile applications, it goes again back to that original principle of we're trying to protect the resources. So
Yeah.
we're trying to protect like that endpoint, that SharePoint endpoint to go and get files. Once you have the file on your device, going and requiring that you do multi-factor authentication to start up Word to open a local file doesn't really provide much security protection. Or concerned it could even like mislead people in terms of thinking that they're providing some sort of security protection, where of
Right.
course if someone has access to the device, they can get to that file in all sorts of different ways. And that kind of pattern goes pretty much for anything that you would have down on your device.
Okay.
That just protecting like opening an application with any of these policies doesn't really provide much from a security perspective.
Got it. I think that's important to
Cool.
call out too, because I feel like before I had dealt more with Azure Active Directory and conditional access, I think I might have blended those two together. Obviously, I don't now, but I feel like it's a good thing to call out. I'm remembering things of when I would support customers. I'm like, oh gosh, yes, I forgot about this. So this is great.
Yeah. Yeah. This is one of those things that comes up regularly.
Yep, exactly.
So
It does.
even though it's sort of a foundational, this is probably like the most foundational, one of the foundational concepts here. It's
It still
yeah,
gets probably brought up.
it
Yeah.
still gets
So
brought up.
yep.
Yeah. But now from like a more policy enforcement, just kind of like to really cement that point in terms of like what's the impact of that behavior and how does it protect, and the resources and what's the behavior with like mobile and desktop applications. So in this case, like I have a couple of examples where you'd have a typical website that gets a sign-in token. So this is getting an ID token. This is targeted to the website. Audience of the token is the website. So if this is in scope of a conditional access policy and you like target a policy straight to this, then it's going to apply. So it's the green checkbox. Same thing for the web service, that if that website turns around and makes a call to a web service policy and has delegated access token access, then that policy is going to get applied,
Okay.
right? In the case of getting an ID token for a mobile or desktop application, which happens and you can do, because then the mobile desktop application uses that more to like, show the user's display name, pull some information about the user to customize the experience.
Okay.
In that case, since this token, like it's targeted towards the mobile app, targeted to, the word app ID or whatever that application is, policy is not going to be applied to it since it falls outside of that cloud app bucket.
Okay.
But when it goes and turns around and has delegated access to a service, that's when policy enforcement happens. So when you're seeing, conditional access policy kick in to require multi-factor authentication when you're using desktop Word, that's because it's connecting to SharePoint, going to like the source of the files and accessing that resource, and there's a policy applied to that resource
Okay.
endpoint.
Okay.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Okay. So now get to show that a little bit in action. What I've done here is I've pretty much crabbed up some bare bones like OpenID Connect protocol requests, and these are not recommended. Like, don't use these for coding your own application. I have like hard to guess nonsense like 1, 2, 3 and all sorts of things that aren't really what you would want to do, but it's enough to get the job done for the
Sure.
demo.
And get the concepts across, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what I have is I have 2 applications that I've registered that are going to be of interest here. So these are in my tenant. I have a web application, and this is registered as auth terms like the confidential client. You can see the app ID here is the OBA, which is kind of enough to remember.
Do you,
And then,
I was going to say, do you want to make that a little bit bigger? I'm just
is it
taking a
really
look
small?
at it. It might be a little.
Is
There we
that,
go. Yep. Well, yeah, I think that one's
that's fine with
perfect.
this. I'm not going to be in
Okay.
this one. Yeah, okay. So this is the web app one, OBA.
Okay.
You can see now. And then the mobile application is registered as like that native application.
Okay.
From the conditional access policy side, I've broken down some of this in like different users that I'll be testing with. So this is a policy that's like the only policy that my user one is in
Okay.
scope of. And the policy I'm going to be showing the behavior with is a policy that applies to all cloud apps. I've excluded like Office 365. This is a pretty common configuration if someone's like locking down access from outside the corporate network to still provide Office 365 access, but they'll like slowly pull in some other services. In this case, both of those app IDs would fall within this policy. Of course, the second one as a mobile application shouldn't actually really be in policy. So
I always like the don't lock yourself out. That's one of my favorites. Don't lock yourself out.
Yeah, it's there for good reasons.
Yeah.
It has also, I'm happy to say, had a good impact in terms of reducing the amount of times people lock themselves out.
That's good. Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay, so this is the one where I've gone app ID is the OBA. I'm an ID token for a WAP.
Okay.
And signing in as user 1. So a conditional access policy that I just showed kicks in, access gets blocked.
I like that.
Now, if I go back and do exact same request, the only thing I'm changing is that application. So it's the app ID of the mobile app, which you wouldn't really put into a browser. I'm just doing it to illustrate the redirect. Right. Typically, this would be kind of like in the pop-up that you see from the app itself. Sign in as that same user. And this is just redirected to kind of like the default configured native client endpoint, giving me the code. And so it's like gone through, completed the authentication request fine. And it wasn't blocked at all by policy.
Awesome.
Right. So that's just kind of illustrate. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's probably the easiest way to show it. Cause like, you always get like stuck trying to figure out how can I show this in a simple way? I like it.
Right. Yeah. And just really to like hopefully show that impact there. The other part of this is, what to look for in the sign-in logs. Now, of course, like this sign-in, I don't know, it takes maybe like 10 or 15 minutes for a sign-in log to show up. But, in preparing for this, I have run enough times that I have log entries already here.
Sure. And you can pull one.
And some request IDs. Yeah. So for that first sign-in, for like the sign-in to the web application, which was not today, this is kind of what you would see. And the main thing that you would look for to differentiate these cases is application. So this is the application type there, that this is a web app.
Okay.
So then that tells me that this application ID would fall in scope of conditional access policies as a web app, which is, then becomes a cloud application. Can also go in and see that that policy kicked in, and this was the one that caused the blocking access. Now, if I go and look at other sign-in for the mobile app, looking at the sign-in for the mobile app is pretty much giving away what I'm going to show. But if you go and you look at the application, it is mobile.
Okay.
So when you see application mobile and app ID, then you can know that this app ID isn't being used as part of conditional access policy enforcement.
Okay.
Right. So even if you somehow explicitly targeted policy to that app ID, it's not going to be applied. It doesn't fall into like that cloud app bucket. Doing policy based off of mobile application, the only real option for doing that is within the conditional access client types. And those are like broader buckets where you can say like this applies to like all mobile and desktop applications. The other reason for that is just, when you get this app ID, it's not very trustworthy. When you get a web app, like a cloud app ID, there's some authentication that's happening, and that cloud app is proving its own identity.
Okay.
In this case, it's a native app, public app, doesn't have a secret because, people are downloading it to their devices and their phones. So you're not going to embed some secret password within it to identify that application. So it's easy to take this app ID and use it in my own app and make it seem like some other desktop or mobile application. So it's kind of another reason that any like policy pivoted around that app ID wouldn't really be like providing necessarily the protection that or the behavior that people would expect.
Okay.
All right. Other case here, I went back a little bit. Which, yeah, so there's also OAuth enforcement. And this is also kind of just falls out of what we've been talking about, like in terms of like the resource protection and all of that. The interesting thing with OAuth 2.0 versus OpenID Connect, because OpenID Connect is like built on top of that OAuth 2.0 framework, but it's around like single sign-on. So there's that ID token that's being issued for the website. In the case of OAuth 2, it's all about delegated access. So some of the initial like OAuth type scenarios, delegated access scenarios, is like giving to Facebook access to your Flickr photos, right? Right. It's not, you're not signing into Facebook with your Flickr account. You're just delegating access to it so that you can put your cool vacation shots on your feed or whatever it is. So in the first hop here, in the OAuth response, there's no ID token. So there's no token that's targeted towards this website. That means that even a policy that's like explicitly targeted to this website isn't enforced because there's no token issued there.
Okay.
But it would still, of course, be applied to the access token, which is used to access the resource based off of that token audience. Now, this is one that catches people by surprise, and also one where we see some apps that use OAuth as a sign-in protocol, which is not recommended. So it creates kind of like unexpected behaviors. So this is one that I'll flag in terms of like, we're looking at how to apply some controls and policy config around this without, of course, like disrupting customer policies that already are out there, where you might suddenly see some, change in behavior.
Okay.
But it's definitely an interesting and surprising one, I think. So I'll do the demo here real quick.
Okay.
This is a fast one. Pretty much just going back, and it's that same request that I used for accessing the website. The only difference here is that in the response type, instead of requesting the ID token, I've narrowed it down to just requesting the code. And so this is about
Ah,
requesting a code that gives you the delegated access to that API. So this is like,
sure.
no longer requesting that ID token. And when I jump back in here and view that request, it just passes by, kind of have like my default web browser redirect to the Microsoft page. So it's just to have a dummy placeholder page, but this shows success with the code and that
Okay.
going through. And that's using that exact same policy that I showed you earlier, which was, policy applied to all cloud apps. So
Sure.
that app ID would fall into that bucket. Is just because there's no token being issued for it. So definitely an interesting case to be aware of. Now, the other important thing to know with all of these caveats and different points within the policy is that when you do an all cloud apps policy, and I was cheating a little bit, that's why I had the exclusion for the Office 365 application in there. If you say all cloud applications and you don't exclude any cloud apps, then the policy kind of kicks into a bit of a different mode where some of these behaviors around like whenever a token's issued, basically. So the policy would be enforced.
Okay.
And that would apply as well to kind of like that flow that I showed just now with the OAuth, or when you were doing like the, native client applications even. So this is like, as you get to those baseline policies that you're going to have across your organization, like require multi-factor authentication, blocking legacy authentication, there's like clear advantages to just having all cloud apps, no exclusions, kind of working to that point. Now, there's reasons to have exclusions as you get there in terms of not wanting to disrupt some user experiences, but definitely, good reasons to get there. Here's just illustrating that same flow, except
Sure.
policy is enforced in both cases. Other common question is, in that app picker that I was showing for the cloud apps,
Hmm.
there are some Microsoft services that are not listed there. There's a good number that aren't listed there. And that, of course, like stands out to people a little bit. And they also, are times they're like, well, I want to apply policy to this service. So quick word on that, which is just like the reason that some services aren't there is internally we kind of have a process where it's more like that app team comes and onboards. A lot of apps and services really are composed of like multiple app IDs with like microservices and all of this, where if each one of those was exposed in the list, it would be huge and super hard to navigate. You can get some sense of that if you go to like the enterprise app blades and kind of like drill in and look at a lot of those and like
Sure.
turn off all the filters and do all of that. So we want to make sure that we're showing the things that are kind of like the most intended to be customer facing. And then there's also some work that we do where we can like really like bundle some of these app IDs under the cover, so that if you apply policy to like Microsoft Teams is a great example, and you to that app ID, really under the covers, we'll be applying that policy to some app IDs that are associated with Microsoft Teams, like their chat service API or free busy and all of that. Nothing that you would ever want to like have to think about or you would ever want to
Right.
set like different access policies on, but just to give a bit more of a curated experience there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Now, the other interesting thing that you can do though, when you do need to get into like more specific and want to, open up the hood and have more control, is with the recent feature that's in public preview for filters for applications. That allows you to set policy to really any cloud app ID, where you can go and apply an attribute to that app ID, and then within the conditional access policy filter, be able to go and like, to do that targeting. I forget. I
Okay.
don't think I gave you that link when I gave you the links. this morning
Oh yeah,
somehow.
you
I think
can
I missed that
just
one.
share it in the chat, and I can show it on the lower third here.
Okay. Oh, I didn't have it on my list. That's why okay, I'll have to look it up later.
Yeah, no
Anyway,
worries, no worries. What
this
we
was announced on like the Azure AD blog. It was like
Right,
October, so there's a blog
right.
post there.
And what we can do, Caleb, is we can add some of that into the show notes. So once this is done streaming today, it'll show up on our YouTube channel. We do
Yeah,
get a lot of on-demand views. We'll make sure that shows up there, and we'll even put this PowerPoint presentation on our GitHub repo so that
that
folks
would be
can
amazing.
take a look at it, ask questions. I'm sure they'll all be following you now on Twitter because that is his Twitter handle, folks. So uh, follow Caleb, bug Caleb, right? Isn't that no? be kind to Caleb. But Caleb's you seem to be like one of those ones that knows quite a bit about conditional access. So I feel like you're the one-stop shop. Maybe.
I, I, I do my best to seem that way.
Oh,
Okay, another interesting topic for sure. There's some built-in App ID exclusions where you could even see a policy that's for all cloud apps, but policy would not be enforced on specific cloud app API endpoints. And
okay.
this is kind of the list. And the reason for that is there are some endpoints which are just kind of like so core to the bootstrapping service of like policy getting up and running that if you
Sure.
apply policy to them, that it can create kind of like these almost like deadlock situations. Like the easiest one I think to think about is if you create a conditional access policy that says require a compliant device for all cloud apps in your organization, that's not going to get enforced for the device registration and enrollment endpoints.
Okay.
Because otherwise you're caught in this total like catch 22 when it's like, oh, you need to have a compliant device, go get a compliant device. You can't because you don't have a compliant device. Right. So it's for that case. And then the other
Okay.
one that I think is worth calling out here is the multi-factor auth connector, which is one of these like internal, small service endpoints that we normally wouldn't really be talking about. But the impact here and the reason that there's an exclusion is this is when you're using the authenticator application. And then you're registering for passwordless, that some of the registration steps go through here. And when that rolled out, there was a bunch of customer issues where, a MAM policy was rolled out to require apps with app protection. And the intent wasn't really to have that policy applied to the authenticator application, but since the
Sure.
authenticator application is not managed, it also meant that was like cutting off that bootstrapping experience where it's like, go and, bring your device into management, go and try and register your
Right.
strong
Right.
credentials, and that's failing. So just kind of like that internal registration. You can see here too, there's like some of these check-in type places too, where it's just like reporting like the state of the device where the policy wouldn't apply. It's not too often that questions about this comes up, but more just wanted to raise it since we're doing this deeper dive on some of these interesting behaviors. If you do happen to see any of that.
Okay.
Okay. Now for MS Graph API, which is also like the most common one of the very common like app targeting questions. Why can't I
Right.
set policy on MS Graph API? And I missed one of my things in the animation. Okay, so MS Graph API is, aggregates access to a bunch of other workload services. Like behind the covers, there's all these service endpoints that then different teams own that like serve up the data, like, directory data, mail, Teams, Intune management, SharePoint, all of that, right? So you can see in policy evaluation, like, oh, my policy is getting blocked on MS Graph API. So I want to exclude MS Graph API.
Okay.
And then like the downside of that is that could be that you're getting blocked on MS Graph API because, your application or the application you're using needs access to SharePoint to be able to get some files. If because of that requirement, you then went and like removed MS Graph API as a policy requirement, it opens up this massive security door, right? There's like this huge blast radius, because in
Okay.
an effort to like just have this one like desktop app work or like not be impacted by a specific policy, then everything that's behind Microsoft Graph API now or in the future has that same exception to it.
Okay.
And being able to do that is just like makes the policy enforcement pretty unpredictable. MS Graph API itself doesn't really contain any data. Like there's no like resource within Microsoft Graph API, which is kind of like another reason going back to with conditional access policy, we're trying to protect access to resources. So having a policy on MS Graph service like itself doesn't really protect anything. So instead, what we do is we apply policy to MS Graph based off of the permissions that are inside the token. So here are just some of like the examples of the mappings that are all, for the most part, like pretty intuitive. That like if you have a mobile app that's accessing SharePoint and that access token has file.read all access to it, what we'll do is when we're issuing that token from Azure AD, we'll see that that's going to be the permission that's issued. We'll then map it back to the app ID to SharePoint that a policy would have been applied to. So say require, multi-factor authentication for SharePoint, and we'll enforce that policy so that when you've gone and you've applied a policy, to protect the files in SharePoint, whether someone's going straight through the web flow or if they're going through a mobile app that just, happens to call MS Graph API, that same policy enforcement is going to be applied. But that policy enforcement isn't going to impact like access to mail or some other resource. To illustrate this one, I also have like another set of nice little test cases to go through.
Okay. Let's do it.
All right. For this one, I have a different user that I will be using. And let me first go through and show the policies that are going to impact this user too. So I have two policies that will impact this user. The first one is applied just to SharePoint. And it's going to require multi-factor authentication.
Okay.
In order to access SharePoint. Second policy is just targeted to Exchange. And just to have something different that pops up, I have a little sample like terms of use page that you have to agree to before accessing email content. Okay, so those are the two policies that are going to come into play here. In this first example, I'm using the same web application that I've used before, and just using this call that isn't requesting any like real resource specific scopes. These are all just general scopes that are part of the OpenID Connect protocol. Come on in here. Sign in with my right user. And again, just kind of get redirected to that dummy page that I'm using, or not. It's not a dummy page, but for my application. Just to not put anything up, right? So that shows that the authentication succeeded, which we'd expect it would, because in this case, it's like my web application getting an ID token. There's no real graph access that's happening there for SharePoint or Exchange. If I come back and this request has the one modification that I'm requesting files.read access, so SharePoint access. Now I get that prompt for multi-factor authentication. And I can even just go in here, see if I can do this. Let's say I can do it, but if I go and change files.read to mail.readWrite, now it's going to go and try and get that token for Exchange instead, which triggered that terms of use policy.
Okay.
And if I had both, then both policies need to be satisfied, since conditional access policies are additive. There's an and between those policies. Now, applications can use this to either request all the scopes that they want up front. This is what we refer to as like early bound policy enforcement.
Okay.
In order to just sign into the application, you can do that. Or it's also possible to like do a step up within the app. So like you've signed into the mobile application, you're doing your thing, and then you get to some part of that application that requires a specific permission, and make the request at that point to go step up. And if there's policy requirement, the end user will see it then. And that's good for cases when you're in an application that needs the permission for, a rarely used feature, or a less core task to the application, just to get people into the app, doing their 80% of what they're going to do in that application, and then having the added friction when it's needed, and having that control like allows you to build those sorts of experiences too, or for app
Nice.
developers to build that type of experience. Cool. So that's that. And the other part to call out is, when you have one of these conditional access policies that's all cloud apps but some excluded applications, there are also some permission scopes that get excluded by default as well. And these gets questions too. And the reason for these exclusions is they're pretty much core to like the OpenID Connect protocol to function for like the desktop mobile applications, or for the cloud apps, that these are applications that have been consented to, and there's like policies that are being enforced on them in the environment. So they can perform some of these like pretty common tasks. Because if you look at these, particularly for like the desktop mobile applications, like these permissions allow access to like very limited, like, current user information, and those are things that you might get in the access token, in the ID token anyway, about that user, like their, UPN or email address. And you get those from the user read and user profile read. People then shows a little bit of that, like that relationship with other people, but is like a pretty small opening of that was available there. And then for the cloud apps, there's these other ones that are more about like apps that have access to them, like read all users in the directory for experience of like, in chat, that you can find somebody and who you're going to send that message to, since those would be like common blocking scopes where apps just wouldn't work in like this more secure policy configuration, where you've targeted to cloud apps with excluding these like front end applications.
Okay.
The other important thing to call out here too is like, this is just policy enforcement. So this is not like granting access. This does not mean all cloud apps can suddenly call user.readAll. It means a cloud application that, has been consented and granted permissions in order to do that, won't be blocked by a conditional access policy when it's performing that action that it's been, been provisioned to do.
Very cool. And I was just gonna say, Jeff is answering like all of the questions in chat. So thanks, Jeff. We are joined by Jeff and Mark in the chat. So if you've got questions, in theory, those guys can answer it. I mean, that's what they do on a daily basis, right? But I just checked, and they keep answering all the questions. So thank you
Fantastic.
guys. Thank you guys.
I'm excited
In
to get back
theory,
in
Mark says in
theory.
theory.
That's the only comment I read now.
We have to give them a hard time. They're not on camera. At some point, this will evolve to them being on camera. So, which is going to be a fun one for us as a team.
Yeah.
We're a small team, and we're starting to expand and bring more people into the fold. And I think Mark and Jeff will be some of the first beta testers in that on that flight. So
I'm looking forward to that.
Jeff just said, what you don't know is we have a side chat asking Caleb. That is hilarious. That is hilarious. Here we go. So just so everybody knows, Jeff doesn't really know the answers. He's asking Caleb, and Caleb must be frantically. I don't know. I don't see you typing.
This is
so
not true. This is not true at all. All right. So starting to get into the wrap up a little bit. I mean, like some of the takeaways from this is, I would just say, like repeating that you know, when you're thinking about some of the baseline policies like that MFA protection, blocking legacy auth, having the all cloud app policy without exception is going to provide both the best security and really end user experience as well too.
Okay.
Because as you hit different apps that have different policies, there can be like some seams in terms of like, when a user sees an unexpected prompt, or even worse, if there's an application that's kind of not expecting to interrupt it at a certain point. So that's a good target to work towards for
Sure.
any of those like real baseline policies. When you do exclude policies from the baseline, it's just good to consider the impact and to, look at particularly which services those applications call, because they can often, snowball a little bit then in terms of like, oh, I have this application that needs to access these other two endpoints, so then they also need to be excluded. And the last one is just like, and then when you have resources or, like app endpoints that you have really high impact data or actions behind, then, do the individual app targeting, apply the strong policies, and apply that enforcement on those endpoints. Because then
Okay.
within all this too, that's, definitely like right in conditional access's wheelhouse in terms of like applying that policy to do resource protection on the web endpoint. The other one that we wanted to talk about is just kind of like, of course, this brings up maybe about policy design. So giving some resources for policy design or identifying gaps.
So if you
One thing I
want,
wanted to show
Caleb,
here.
I
Yeah.
was going to say I've got shortened links for all of those. So when you want to go
Oh,
through each one of the
fantastic.
docs, I can just share that in the lower third for the folks that are tuning in. Sometimes folks miss something in the longer link, and so we tend to do the shortened URL just to help folks out.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so the first one on the list there was just kind of like what's built into conditional access right
Sure.
now. And there's a public preview around an overview blade, which has really, I think, a lot of helpful information here, giving some high-level tips, high-level analysis, things you should be aware of, like IPv6 on Azure AD is coming. You want to make
Right,
sure
right.
you have name location policies that you have IPv6 in those policies.
Yeah.
Views of like app coverage and being able to drill into those and see what your policies are doing, and then also monitoring for different policies and
Okay.
impact on sign-ins. So I think there's a lot of useful content there. But then there's some other tools too, both that can go and help you go and analyze your policies and handle of what you have in your environment, and then external as well too. I mean, we talked in the planning for this, and we just want to do that call out. Like we think it's fantastic. There's like community
there's
around this,
tons.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe what we'll do here is the Azure AD assessment. That way, if you're watching this, I mean, unless you want to hit pause and you want to grab the full URL, that'll take you to the URL. And then we'll give it a couple more seconds here on the video. We can go to the conditional access workbook. All right, and this is the gap analysis or gap analyzer. And then the Azure AD exporter, which is one of my favorite tools. And these are good links for us to have just in general in our repository. We've got a ton of links that we've used over the course of the show's evolvement over time. And then we've got the GitHub conditional access. Wanted to specify that it is GitHub. It's not, we have our own documentation and it's pretty expansive, but then there's also community driven efforts that it's great that we're giving shout outs to those folks.
Yeah.
Because I think that's something that continues to actually astound me. Being at Microsoft as long as I have been, which it's only 5 years, feels like an eternity at this point, but in a good way. But it just feels long, and it's nice to see that the community is still actively building stuff to help supplement our documentation. So, here's
It's fantastic.
the conditional access optics. So I'll take you to that GitHub repo. And then what I can also then show here too is the DC toolbox, which I think I always search for this. I knew it came from a blog post, but I don't think and I always just search for it, right? Like I shouldn't search for it. I should just probably have it as a bookmark finally. Graduate and actually have it as a bookmark. Very
Yeah, no,
cool.
thanks for sharing those, and I
Yeah.
probably, like, technically have to say that, like, listing all of these here are not necessarily an endorsement, right? 'Cause but I just wanted to get, like, we thought it was good to get the exposure for people so you can go and look at these tools and evaluate how to use them and, how they work in your environment.
Yeah, and we'll create a brand new GitHub repository for the show. We'll
Awesome.
put the PowerPoint in there. We'll also link to all of the links in the show notes for this specific episode. We'll also link to your LinkedIn. Obviously, if somebody was on Twitter, they'd be able to follow you because that's your Twitter handle. I think I mentioned that, but I'll mention it again in case people are tuning in. We've had a lot of people tune in today, so this is really
Oh,
an
great.
exciting topic
Great,
for
great.
us. I think at the high end, we had almost 40 people across all of our platforms. So thanks everybody for
Great.
tuning in.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think let me double check and make sure there's no more questions. Or we're kind of ramping up, right, Caleb? Kind of the
We're
end for
ramping up
today?
to being ramping down, yeah.
Ramping up to being
Exactly.
ramping down.
I
I
have
like
my
we're
thank
ramping
you,
up
the
to ramping
questions,
down.
like, yeah.
Well, and I was gonna say, I think Jeff and Mark answered all of the questions. So, again, Caleb, thank you for joining. Thanks for being our guinea pig. It's a new show that we will be doing monthly in conjunction with Jeff and Mark. They've been finding folks to find topics to present on, and in theory, the next time you see this, you might see one of them on the show, which will be even more hilarious because it's been the JP and Shannon show for the last year. It used to be Christos too, and so it's nice to turn it over to more folks in the division to get them to get their messages out there, right? So want to thank you for giving us almost an hour of your time and thank everybody for tuning in across all of the platforms that we stream on. What I am going to do now before we end is I'm going to find a good spot or a good channel to raid here. So bear with me. Let's see. We'll go to C Sharp Fritz. I feel like this guy's always streaming. I love C Sharp Fritz. So I'm going to start the raid now, and that'll take everybody over to his channel. Thanks again, Caleb. And with that, I will wrap up the show now.
All right, well, thanks so much.
Of course, take care.
All right, bye.